Can everybody hear me? If you can hear me, I'll wave your hands. Only problem is I can't see if you're waving your hands or not. But I imagine if you can't hear me, my phone will ring shortly or something will happen. I wanted to thank Shiva Ray for that beautiful yoga class, for that down-tempo prana flow vinyasa. Thank you, Shiva, so much. And also to Juliet Rabia for her incredible singing and poetry, and to Adam Malouf for his beautiful handpan playing. And before that, to the brothers Franzik for joining us and sharing their gifts and big hearts with us. So thank you all for your patience with the process here and creating this Bless Fest online experience for us. And the Lucy's Love Bus video really tugs at your heart. And if you feel inspired to donate and help out those families, please do. You can hit the donate button below. You can donate multiple times. You know, you could actually donate 60 times if you wanted to. You know, boom, boom. But you could just it's possible. I'm just saying, in theory. So now we move into a little bit of DrumStory, which is sacred storytelling. You know, storytelling is old. It's ancient. It's as old as humans have been on the earth. It's a way for us to connect with each other and to share wisdom and to share ritual. Really, storytelling was the first. Google, oh, I think I might be a little too close to the mic. I'm going to step away just a little bit. Storytelling was the first Google. It was the first library. It was the first entertainment. It was the first Hollywood. It was the first Bollywood. And it was the first sacred text. And, you know, cultures live by stories and myths, and they profoundly influence our deep psyche. And I remember hearing the Mamos speak. The Mamos are Native American Indians who live in the mountains of northern Colombia at about 15,000 feet. And they came down from the mountains and they're starting to come down and share with Westerners that now is the time that we need to protect the earth. And they have incredible stories, and they're really deep shamans. You know, today everybody's a shaman, right? They're going to buy a drum on Amazon and they're a shaman. But these guys are real shamans. They spend the first 9 years of their life in a cave. The first 9 years of their life in a cave in complete darkness, and they're nurtured by other shamans and their parents, and there's enough light so they don't go blind. But their connection to the spirit world, even though they're born into this world, their connection never dies. And at the age of 9, they come out and they look at this physical world, their first time out of the cave. And they're so connected deep inside. So these shamans came down to North America, who grew up the first 9 years of their lives in these caves. And the main way they shared their wisdom was through story. They didn't get intellectual. They didn't get theoretical. They didn't throw out hypotheses. They shared little cute, meaningful stories, short ones. And a lot of them were like about spiders and how the spider was greedy. And then the spider changed its heart and it started to give and give and give. And stories about how beings who are protecting the earth, and really beautiful little stories. And I realized these are the stories these are the myths that they're living by. The information that informs the way they behave towards themselves, what they expect of themselves, and how they relate to others. And when you think about the myth that drives us, even though we know the American dream is really kind of a bunch of crap in many ways, it still powerfully influences us. And really, it's a dream that stops at the third chakra. It's a myth that stops at the third chakra. It's about getting what I want. And if I get what I want, then I'm going to be happy and everything's going to be fine. And we know that's bunk. We know so many people who have everything they want and they're miserable, sometimes even more miserable than when they were trying to acquire things or status. So we need a new myth, especially if we're going to save the earth and our species. Well, the earth will probably live on without us for another, God knows how many billion years. But if we're going to save ourselves as a species, we need a myth that includes the whole organism of our being. We need a myth that implies into our unconscious what the great saints know and have revealed to us in their teachings and in their awakenings. Otherwise, we are living a half-baked myth that is not a complete myth. It has no potential to actualize the human psyche and the human spirit. So we need these ancient myths. We need other myths than the myths of the American dream. So I don't have too much time tonight. So I'm just going to jump right in. I'm going to tell us, this is a story from the First Nations people, from the North American Indians. And yeah, so I think we'll just begin. Once under time, or above time, or around time. It might have even been right in the center of time. And there are many say that it happened way, way outside of time. There was a young woman, and she lived with her two parents in a beautiful teepee. And she was a beautiful woman with long, dark hair. And the teepee was a beautiful teepee. Teepees can be so beautiful and peaceful and humble. And she lived there, right there in that teepee for a long time. And she was growing older, and she was growing older. And many men in the village, they wanted to marry her. You know, this happens. The men, they wanted to marry her. But she wanted nothing of it. She was not interested. Have you ever just been, you're not really interested, you know? She wasn't really interested in anybody in the entire village. And time went by, and the men were, they were frustrated, they were upset. And then one day, these teepees had little windows. They had things cut out where you could actually see out them. She saw all of a sudden, out of nowhere, almost like a mystical thing, this man walked in, a stranger entered the village. He was a very handsome man. He was clearly a hunter. He had a long black beard and a long mane of hair, and he was very fit, and he clearly had a big sword, and he was a hunter. And she had her eye caught. She was curious. Have you ever been curious about somebody? She was curious. And she watched him as he walked through the village. He walked around a few teepees and around the central fire. It was almost as if nobody even in the village saw him except for her. And then he started to exit the village, and before she knew it, she realized he was at the edge of the village, and he slipped into the forest. Well, she was curious. She was so curious. She grabbed a few things and she started off. She didn't even tell anybody. She didn't tell her parents. She didn't tell me. She just grabbed her moccasins and a few other things, and off she ran into the forest to try to find him. And she was running down the path. Oh my God. And all of a sudden, there off in the distance, about 200 yards in front of her, she saw him. And she started to follow. And she slowed way down. And she just started walking, keeping her distance at about 200 yards. Now, this went on for quite some time, 2 or 3 miles. And then all of a sudden, she lost him. She could not see him. And then all of a sudden, he just popped his head out from behind a tree. And she was so startled. There he was, like 3 feet from her. And he said, "Do not follow me." He said, "Do not follow me." And with that, he turned and he walked on. He walked down. Oh, she was curious. She was frustrated, and she thought she should turn around, but then she thought again. Have you ever, it kind of made her more curious, even like more curious. Like, okay, he's saying I shouldn't follow him, but that kind of made her more curious. Have you ever been like made more curious? Like you were curious, and then all of a sudden you were like made more curious? Well, that's what happened. And she kept walking, and the trees started getting smaller and smaller as they were approaching the tundra. And then all of a sudden, he stepped out from behind a huge rock, and he was right there again. He said, "Ah! Nah! I told you, do not follow me. Do not follow me." And with that, he stepped off into the tundra. Now, the tundra has no trees, just some rocks. Well, she almost turned around, but at the last minute, she decided, no, I am following this man. I am so curious as to where he's going and who he is. So she followed from about 500 yards behind, walking behind rocks and shrubs, hoping that he wouldn't notice. And then all of a sudden, a great blizzard came up, and all of a sudden, they were at a huge lake. And it was a frozen lake, thick ice, like, thick. And he walked right onto the lake. And the snow came, and she ran. She ran to try to catch him because she couldn't really see him in the snow anymore. And she ran. And finally she saw him. He was about 50 yards ahead in the snow. And just then, all of a sudden, he dove. Can you believe it? Okay, we got a frozen lake here. And all of a sudden, there was a hole in the lake. And he dove into the lake. He dove into the lake. Did you hear that? I said he dove. And he started to swim. And then she dove into the lake. And she started to follow him. And the water in this part of the world was so clean and so clear, like all the waters used to be, untouched by pollution, untouched by chemicals, untouched by man, unpoisoned and crystal clear. And she could see 50 yards through the water as clear as day. And she noticed, surprisingly, he had turned into a polar bear. Into a polar bear, I tell you. He was a huge, furry, wet polar bear under the water, and she was surprised. I mean, you might be surprised, too, if somebody was a man and then they were a polar bear. And she couldn't hold her breath too long, and she couldn't see the hole above her. And now polar bears, did you know, I think they can hold their breath for a long time, and they're super powerful swimmers. So she was a little concerned she would never get out of that lake alive. Have you ever followed somebody a little too long and you're like, oh my God, am I going to get out of this alive? Oh my God, what was I thinking? All the signs were there, all the red flags were there all the way along, and I just, And there she was, under that lake, and then she saw the polar bear. He climbed up out of a hole, he found a hole, and he climbed up. And she swam, holding her breath with her lungs about to burst. And she finally just barely made it to that same hole. And she pulled her way up. She pulled her way up. She pulled her way up. And she stood up. In the middle of that lake, she stood up. And she looked off into the distance. And that polar bear was running as fast as he could into the middle of that blizzard and into the middle of that lake. And at this point, she thought, I am not going to follow this being anymore. You ever gotten to that point in your life? Yes, is that okay? I'm not going to do this anymore. And that's how she felt. And the polar bear disappeared. And with that, she looked down at her feet and she noticed she had no skin on her feet. And then she looked further, she noticed she had no veins and she had no muscles and there was no tendons. There was nothing on her feet except her feet were just bones. And she looked at her ankle and there was no skin. And on her calf, there was no calf and there was no gastrocnemius. There was no thigh, hamstring, adductor. There was no iliopsoas. There was no small intestine, no ileocecal valve. There was no liver, no lung, no spleen. There was not even a heart beating in her chest. No lungs, no muscles, no brain. She was bones. She kind of freaked out, as is to be expected. She couldn't believe it. Oh my God, I can't. She tried to catch her breath, but she couldn't really catch her breath because she didn't have lungs to catch her breath with. And she really started to freak out. And she just turned and she started to run. And she started to run like a bag of bones across that lake. Across that lake and then onto that tundra and through those rocks and through the forest. And she ran all day and she ran all night. And she ran like she's never run before. And she was a skeleton. And she ran faster than she's ever run until the next morning, finally, she got home. And she landed in her village. And she was exhausted. And as she entered her village and she saw her teepee and she was walking and stumbling towards her teepee, everybody was just waking up in the village and they came out of their teepees and they saw a skeleton. And she looked at herself and she realized she was still a skeleton. For some reason, she thought, oh my God, by the time I get home, I'm going to be myself again. But no, and everybody in the village freaked out. You might freak out too if a skeleton walked into your house. And everybody freaked and they grabbed everything and they ran and they ran. And they didn't, Native American Indians could break down a village super fast. It takes them an hour and they're totally broken down. The teepees are rolled up, everything, the dried meat is taken with them. They didn't do any of that. They left everything right there and they all just vanished into the forest. They all, and she was too tired to chase after them. She was so exhausted. She collapsed in her teepee and she fell into a deep, deep sleep and everybody in the village was gone. Completely gone. And she woke up the next morning. And she stepped out and she realized everybody was gone. And she called for people and she wept. But when she wept, there were no tears because she had no eye ducts to create moisture, to allow moisture to roll down her cheeks because she had no cheeks. And she screamed and she cried in hysteria. And she went looking for them in the forest and she could never find them. And she went back to her village. And this went on for some time. And people would come by the village and they would enter the village and be so curious. Look at the dried meats. Everything's here. The horses, the ponies, the teepees, everything. And she would walk out so eager to see them and try to hug them and explain. And they would freak out again and they would vanish. And she was, you know what she was? She was completely isolated. Have you ever felt isolated? Have any of us ever felt socially distanced? This went on for many months of aloneness, sheer terror, thinking her life was never going to be the same again. And then when one day 2 young hunters came into the forest and they into the village and they walked into the village and she saw them and she tried to hide because she knew if she saw them, they would, if they saw her, they'd freak. They would run and she hid and they came in and they started to eat the meats and they were like, wow, what is this? And they couldn't, and then slowly she sort of just tried to peek her head out to say hi, just to see them and be kind of friendly. She was trying. And they saw the tip of the skeleton come out of the teepee. And oh my God, that's all they needed. And they were gone. And they ran so fast. Ah! They ran and they ran up over the mountain till they got to their father's hut. Dad, I can't believe we went to this village. There was a skeleton there, and the thing was alive. It peeked its head up a teepee. I've heard about this village. It's haunted. It's crazy. We got to get out of here. I don't know who that was. And the father said, I have heard about this village. And he said, you two boys wait here. I will go down and see this village. Dad, don't you know, it's crazy. It's haunted. Don't go down there. I'll be right back. And sure enough, he picked up his drum and he went down to the village and he walked in. And the sun was just going down. And he peeked in each teepee, and finally he peeked into her teepee, and she was asleep, lying there, a bag of bones, needed no blanket, needed no covers, because she could not get cold, because she was as cold as you can be. And he picked up his drum and he started to play. Kiewate leño leño mahota. I know. Kiewate leño leño mahota. I know. Let us be one with the infinite sun forever and ever and ever. Let us be one with the infinite sun forever and ever and ever. And he sang like this for some time, and as he sang, tendons appeared on her ankles. And muscles between her toes showed up, and veins running up and down her leg, and there was a huge carotid artery appearing on her neck. And all of a sudden, she had a gastrocnemius, and she had a liver, and she had a spleen. And as he sang, she had a beautiful beating heart, and she had long black hair and bright brown eyes. And she was sleeping. And as she woke and she saw the skin of her arm, she could not believe it, and she heard him saying, I know. And he sang all night long, and he sang all night long. And in utter exhaustion, as the sun was coming up, he fell down right there at the entrance to the teepee into a deep sleep. And she awakened, fully in awe of her body, of herself back, and tears of joy streamed down her face. And she immediately picked up the drum, and she too started to sing, let us be one with the infinite. And she sang, and she sang, and she sang. And as she sang, he became younger and younger and younger. And the lines on his face disappeared. And all of a sudden, he was a young man. And they could not believe it as they looked into each other's eyes. And they both danced and sang around the fire for the remaining time in that day. And then he said, oh, I've got to go see my sons. And he says, will you come with me? And she says, of course I'll come with you. Of course I'll come. And he grabbed his drum. Like this. And he ran, and they ran up. And he burst into his hut, and his sons were there. And he said, oh my God, so good to see you guys. And the sons did not recognize him. They did not recognize him. They did not recognize the girl. And he was like crazy talking. He was saying, oh, sons. And they said, you're not my sons. And the two boys were just beside themselves, and they disappeared, and they ran off into the forest. They couldn't understand what was happening. Where was our father? And at that point, the man put his drum on the ground, just like this. just like this. With the drum side down to the ground, and the two of them, right there while dancing, they jumped into the drum and they disappeared. And I'll tell you, in this realm, they were never seen again. And they became the dirt. They became the trees and the sky. They became the leaves themselves, and they became the air. And they disappeared, and they became the drum itself. I think they became the rhythm. They disappeared into the rhythm, And I'll tell you right now, that is all I know. So I know we've all had times in our life when we feel like a skeleton and we maybe feel like the village is gone. Certainly now, in many ways, we probably feel that way. There's many ways to look at these stories and many ways to share these stories. The one thing I'll say about this story is that it is not a glorification of youth. If anything, it's a glorification of the elder who helped her, because he was the only one who could help her, was an elder. Him becoming young is a metaphor for, rejuvenation from within, a reconnection to source. God knows we have enough glorification of youth in our culture. I don't think we need more of that. But we do need more elders. We definitely need more elders. And we have an elder who's going to speak next, actually. I'm so glad Jorge Luis Delgado will be joining us. I heard him speak a few weeks ago online, and he touched my heart so much that I looked him up and sent him a note and asked him if he'd like to speak at Bless Fest. And he kindly said, yes, he's in Peru. He's speaking to us from Lima, I believe. So let me just tell you a little bit about Jorge Luis Delgado. In the Inca tradition, there is no separation between the physical and spiritual worlds. Jorge Luis Delgado is an expert at walking this path between both worlds. He received his early training from the Kalawaha shamans of the Northeast Lake Titicaca region, the lineage of the wise ones of the Andes, and from the Cuero, elders of Cusco, who are the last remaining tribal descendants of the Incas. He's the author of Andean Awakening, an Inca guide to mystical Peru, and a forthcoming book, Pachacuti, Return to Joy. Jorge Luis is recognized worldwide as an authority on Incan philosophy and tradition. Jorge was born in the highlands near Lake Titicaca, Peru, and is of Amara I'm not pronouncing that right. Hopefully he can correct me. Incan heritage. His mother is from a family of herders, and his father was a teacher. Jorge is a chakaruna, a bridge person who assists people in connecting to their spiritual self within their own traditions. Jorge Luis Delgado lives in Puno with his wife and 3 children. But I believe he's coming to us from Lima. I'm not quite sure. So we are honored to have Jorge with us. So very honored. Thank you, Jorge. And with no further ado, we will hand it over to Jorge Luis Delgado. Muchas gracias, señor.